For about 10 years, I've been developing this material by using this method to turn seawater into stone. Roland and his lab and his team have separately been developing these other material methods with robotics and algorithmic processes. The narrative itself is very much based around what's really happening and what's been happening for a long time in the environment. I guess the result of designers being able to perform what they do unchecked, because there's no regulation on what we do.
There's no oversight to this, and it's up to designers' individual kind of ethical position as to how they act in the world. And I guess in many ways, I think what some of our early conversations about this project was about how we actually engage with that.
This project is similar to a lot of the work that I do, which talks about accountability in a way, or material usage, not as a specific thing, but as part of it all. So I'd been working on this material. Roland's doing his thing. We met, we were set up on I guess you would call it a commercial blind date or something, a creative blind date. I don't know what you would describe it. He didn't buy me dinner, but it was
an arranged marriage of design. The project is really operating at the intersection of a whole series of different concerns. So part of those are about material experimentation, part of it is about ethical concerns around the climate crisis, part of it is taking a critical position and trying to create awareness. Part of it is about aesthetic and formal experimentation and design experimentation. And really, we're trying to look at how all these things come together and can manifest in a project which is partly about the creation of objects, it's partly about the creation of experience.
Yeah, and all of that hopes to generate discussion at the end. What we are doing culturally as sort of a global activity is killing the ocean, is killing the planet. And there's no word for this yet. We do have terms like ocean acidification, which is it's very hard to pronounce, even in English, the language it's sort of constructed in, but it doesn't mean anything when I say it. It doesn't have any emotional momentum to it. There are other words that we use, like homicide or murder or these sort of things, that bring us much closer to what the emotional spectrum around that act actually is. So the word abyssicide, abyss is the ocean, and side means to kill. So the word it's a neologism. It's a new word that we've created for this project. I don't know if it'll catch because it's just as hard to say as ocean acidification, it seems. If we called it anything else, you wouldn't necessarily mentally place yourself in the narrative and imagine what it is to be doing that thing.
We're trying to talk about the abyss in terms of the abyss of the oceans. We're trying to talk about the abyss in terms of like the future of the planet. And of course, we're trying to, reference, death in this. The original intention was to try and imagine what the future rituals might be of a society in a post-climate collapse scenario. And so trying to imagine almost I don't know if it's realistic or perhaps it's a worst case scenario, but imagining what the rituals will be of that society, and will they return to the old rituals? Will it be a society that returns to rituals such as sacrifice? And so what Sruli and I have designed are garments for drowning in. So it's about giving oneself back to the rising oceans.
But things like the climate crisis are so big that most people not only don't really understand it, but definitely can't process it. So it ends up moving into mythical or religious area. It's so big that we can't understand it. It borders on the idea of awe. And when it's that big, we culturally, over centuries and centuries and centuries, have created rituals and practices around these things that are in no way scientific, they're in no way logical or rational, but they help to make you feel like things will work out your way. Ritual ensures outcome, right? So that's where sort of the scientific method grows out of ritual. What we aim to do is tell this story about something that is actually happening right now in a way that may be too big to understand, just as big as the situation is.
It's operating at two levels. I mean, it's operating at the level of like of criticality and perhaps raising awareness. But on the other hand, we're also trying to change the way we fabricate things and therefore change the way we design things. And so this has really been a shift from thinking about like subtractive or additive fabrication of something to the way you almost grow something. Now, the process we're working with is not technically a growth process, it's technically a mineral accretion process. But it's an idea that you set up the conditions from which form emerges, as opposed to entirely precisely designing something and then fabricating
This is
it
where it
through
gets really interesting,
normative industrial processes. So I guess it's a shift from saying, can we make something geologically as opposed to industrially?
What I think is really interesting is when you take this kind of work that Roland specializes in, which what's the word again?
Well, I guess we work on generative design and robotic and advanced fabrication.
Right, and that stuff is like, there's a human in the loop, but it's between the robot and the material. There's no real space for accident and mistake. And when there is, that's not what you're after. You're after this very specific sort of thing. When you take that sort of thing and you start to treat it with natural processes, you get something really different out of it.
So it's the way that something is very, very precise that we create digitally, and then interacts with a natural process which has a certain type of randomness to it. It has an imprecision, it has an unknown quality. And I guess a lot of what we're trying to explore in the work is the tension between these two things. How can we make something that is neither a digital object, nor is it something which is about the pure stochastic nature of mineral accretion, but it's something in between. It's a negotiation between the two, and we're trying to create some sort of other quality to it. I guess part of it's like it's an aesthetic search we're doing. We're looking for new aesthetic forms and articulation. The project was not so much about trying to draw on the forms of coral, but much more on the processes of coral. And
there was a point though where we were leaning quite heavily towards the look of coral, or at least shells and that sort of thing. But when we call it a biomimetic process, it's actually that the way the material is formed is very, very similar to the way coral builds its skeleton.
The project is negotiation and balance between a whole series of different things. And so it started off being a material experimentation, and this is something that Sruli's been working on for many years now around material accretion. It started off being a series of sketches that Sruli and I sort of did back and forth. And then as we started to see what forms were coming out of these processes, we then started to look at what type of technologies we could use to reify them, to fabricate them and make them. And then those started to inform the more detailed design. So we realized there was sort of two types of skeletons we wanted to create for these garments. And one was around 3D printed nylon objects, which had quite a three-dimensional quality to them, and other parts which were made from robotic incremental sheet forming. And these were sort of, flatter, less three-dimensionally complex forms. And as we started to then experiment with those two types of technologies and understand what their limitations were in terms of the types of forms and the scale, etc., they could work on, that then got fed back and affected the way we would sketch or the way we would 3D model. And so it becomes this interaction of an interest in coral growth and limestone accretion, an interest in the digital tools we're using, the behavior of robots, the potential of 3D printing, and the way these things all come together and start to inform each other.
The positions that we put the mannequins in were, or the bodies into, were, I guess, submissive in a way. They weren't sexualized like that, but submissive in a more ceremonial way. And we modeled them to be somewhat asexual. The forms of the objects came from the positions of the bodies. So the body position came first, then the forms came from that. And then the positions of the bodies in relation to each other was very much graphic, like what actually looked better. When the audience sees the work, they do need to have some reaction. No reaction is terrible, some reaction is important. And we put the environment together in such a way that created a sense of uncertainty in the audience as they went in.
There's a play on the relationship between beauty and horror in the work. Horror in terms of like the climate collapse, I guess, where we're looking towards a future and, we're understanding the potential horror of that scenario. But at the same time, we're creating things which are deliberately trying to be beautiful. And we're interested in what is the relationship between these. And so, as Sruli is describing, the bodies, the poses are obviously partly about sacrifice. I mean, these are garments of drowning. But at the same time, they're set up in a compositional way, which is, as Sruli said, highly graphic. It's something which is about the objects themselves, but also the space between the objects and the way that they sort of make meta shapes as you move around them. They sort of come into focus in different ways, and we're interested in the form of the aggregate of these things.
If you have children, or if you're ever around children, you can see that up until 3 or 4 years old, they are constantly in a state of everything is brand new. And when everything is brand new and exciting, it's somewhat magical, interesting. So as adults, and for some of us, grown-ups, to be able to kind of access that feeling again when we have the entire world in our hand, in a cell phone, all of the information, how everything is made, and an explanation of everything, to be able to, I guess, be given the gift of experiencing awe, I think is, I think that's probably what I'm here to do. I think Roland is probably here to do that as well. We worked with Marno Tolasius, who I've been working with for almost 20 years, 15 years. And with him, I think as Roland saw, it's just, you explain kind of what you need to get, and then you just let them do their part, right?
The brief was about like trying to shoot these things as though they're in some type of abyss. And so it's partly trying to make them appear that perhaps they're underwater, but not be so deliberately referential in that way. And so we're leaving a certain ambiguity. So, but yeah, there was certainly this attempt to like situate it in the photography outside of a known context. Sruli and I don't ever describe ourselves as artists. What we're trying to do is bring together concerns around narrative, concerns around the crises of the world, technology, and design. And of course, these things, when they come together, they make things which are inherently formal, and they have these strong aesthetic qualities. And so sometimes it's sort of, I guess it's really described it just before as something between design and art. Maybe it is, but it's not. We're not consciously trying to position the work there.
Ideas like design and art are transactional things. Those words are artifacts of a capitalist system. So in this sense, we were able to make this work without having to be influenced by the decisions of transaction at the end. We didn't have to sell it to do it. The message itself talks about things people don't want to talk about. People don't want to talk about death. They don't want to talk about climate crisis. They don't want to talk about limiting their online purchases. So it's kind of tricky. Like, it's not accessible in that way.
this project is this amalgamation of all these things, and it's come about through them. And yes, you could use a 3D printing process to make an iPhone cover, or a coral accretion process to do that. But this project exists at a very specific intersection of a set of concerns, which make
material
it
design and
specific to this.
narrative. With a project like this, and with all of the projects that I work on, there needs to be this balance between the material, the design, and the narrative. These are sort of three elements that actually make something interesting to me. And when I look at other people's work, the same sort of thing. I need to see those three things for it to be able to translate. In this case, we had a very interesting new material. We had design work that translated that material specifically, and we had a narrative that tied this together in a way that was uncomfortable.
There's so much in the project that it's going to go off in this whole series of different directions as well. I think that partly, I mean, directly for ABYSSICIDE, the next aspect of this is the making of the film. So I guess that we've made the objects, we've created the experience through the exhibition at Melbourne Design Week. But the next thing is, like, how does this become a film that's currently in post-production? Each of the processes in this project are going to have other lives. The sort of robotic forming processes, the 3D printing processes, these will be reinterrogated and reapplied to new projects. And I know that Sruli has a whole series of forthcoming plans around the mineral accretion and how we can kind of expand that, through products and objects in kind of a broader way. My practice is really, it has two halves. It has a research lab, the Tectonic Formation Lab at RMIT, and then it also has, I have a practice, Snooks Harper, which is an architecture practice. Well, it's more than an architecture practice, it's architecture design. We create public artworks. And so for me, it's always about balancing these two things. It's about balancing a lab, which is exploring new ways of designing, new ways of fabricating, new material processes, and then a practice which is trying to reify those things, to see those things in the real world and how they can have impact on the built environment in some way.
Currently, I'm working on a project about circumcision. I might revisit the last work that I did, which was about euthanasia, objects for euthanasia. I am really interested in this idea of talking about the things that we don't want to talk about, but we should. And the only way I know how to do that is by making things for it, things that exist in that kind of atemporal space. So let's see who I piss off next.